Welcome to TriloTalk. This is a podcast dedicated to topics that we think are important to the profession of medical writing. And our goal is to bring these topical issues and ideas to the forefront and spark conversations in the medical writing community.
We're here to celebrate International Day of Women and Girls in Science. Obviously, these terms also include anyone who identifies this way. This is a day to promote full and equal participation in science for women and girls. Fortunately, in our world of medical writing, not only is the profession dominated by women, it's also dominated by women in leadership positions. Trilogy has 3 senior partners, and 2/3 of them are women, Julia Forjanic-Klaproth and Lisa Chamberlain-James. Today, I'm very happy to be talking to them today about leadership in the medical writing field and how they got here. So, first of all, I'd like to pose a very general question, which is, what has sparked your interest in science?
Gosh, it's a really good question, Douglas, and good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I would say intense curiosity sparked my interest in science. I was always that really annoying kid in the back of the class who kept putting her hand up and saying, but why does that happen? And in the end, I kind of found out that my intense love of biology led me down the biological route as opposed to physics or chemistry. And I ended up doing genetics because that was the area of biology that really seemed to have all the answers to the question why. So I would say maybe because I'm really nosy, because I'm really curious, that's what sparked my interest in science.
I think that's fair enough. And Julia, were you also nosy?
Absolutely. I think it would be exactly the same. I don't know if you guys remember, so I grew up in the 70s, and they used to have these science kits, these chemistry kits that you could buy. And every year, that was the only thing I asked for Christmas from my parents. I want the chemistry kit. I want the science kit. I want the perfume making kit, but not because of the perfume, because I wanted to mix the stuff together and figure out what happens. And, I'm not sure if it's because my parents never bought me the chemistry kit, if that wasn't one of the reasons I went into science, because I was so desperate to finally start just playing around with those test tubes and mixing things together and figuring out how things worked. And yeah, for me, it was just always, I was drawn to science. I've loved science. Yeah.
I love those kits.
Yeah, so when it's one thing being curious as growing up, but another one to say either actively or not quite so actively that you would like to start studying science in some form. You think that's going to be the way you're going to pursue your career in the future. And let's just take, first of all, before we get anywhere near medical writing, getting into the field of science, was there any pushback? Was there any hurdles you felt as women that you had to overcome in order to be able to start the transition from your curiosity into a career?
Well, I went to school in a convent school, so it was all girls. And when I got to the age of 17, 18 and was looking for university courses, by that time, of course, I was already set on biology, in fact, genetics, even though nobody in my school had really ever heard of genetics. The career advisor certainly hadn't got a clue what it was. But there was a big push in my school for STEM subjects. So there was a really big push for particularly engineering. They wanted much more female representation in the field of engineering, and that wasn't my bag at all. I was very firmly focused on biology. So I think I was probably very lucky. I didn't get any pushback at all about wanting to go into science. In fact, it was actively encouraged. They'd have preferred if I'd done engineering, but unfortunately, they were quite happy for me to go into biology, despite the fact that I didn't really want to be an engineer.
Yeah, and I would say the same. It's interesting. I mean, neither at high school nor at university did I ever encourage anything other than just pure encouragement. They saw, I think, my engagement at high school already, and it was absolutely clear that I wanted to go to university to study science, and they did everything they could at my high school already to help me get there. There was never a question. There was never any tone of, oh, you know, shouldn't you be doing something different? And I never encountered any sense when I was at university of anybody sort of suggesting otherwise. Interestingly, this is where the therapy comes in probably. It was my family who didn't understand why I wanted to study science. So the men in my family questioned it, but I never encountered it in the schooling that I was engaging in.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
I would say the most I encountered was a complete bemusement, because they'd never heard of genetics. They didn't know what it was. And they kind of just thought, oh, this is Lisa being Lisa, and she's off on one and she wants to go do what she wants to do. But it wasn't ever a barrier. I never felt I had a barrier. In fact, the opposite. I think when we hit that age of going to university, the whole world was going, you know what, we might need to address the balance here a little bit.
So I think that's very encouraging to hear for people, that in today's day and age, certainly where you've grown up, there wasn't a barrier as such. In our world of medical writing, we're very fortunate that it is dominated by women for a number of reasons. Maybe we get into that in a minute, but I think just to sort of like bring the discussion a bit more into the world of medical writing, the move from academic science, from studying at university, to medical writing there. Did you notice anything specific to that shift in the emphasis in your career as a woman? Or was it a fairly easy transformation because medical writing is quite dominated by women, or is it not actually an issue at all, which is also an interesting aspect?
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier, the reason I'm kind of went a bit quiet, was because I was really trying to think that far back.
Yeah.
But I don't think the barrier was because I'm a woman. I never felt that trying to get into medical writing. I think the biggest barrier was I didn't know what medical writing was. I didn't know it existed as a career. I knew what I wanted to do, and in terms of, I knew I loved biology, I knew I loved science, and I had to work in that field somehow. And then I had no idea there was this magical mix of my love of wordsmithing and crafting text that would fit with that. So I think that was the biggest barrier that I found. Certainly when I applied for my first medical writing job, it was to a man who was head of the department. I never felt that my sex was a barrier, or actually even was thought about in that way.
Or could have been a benefit if the experience, because there are so many women who are medical writers, that maybe that
Yeah,
was
although I'm just
positive
thinking
thing.
about it, when I got into medical writing, so the group that I went into, I mean, it was a while ago, there were 4 men, and when I joined, I became the third woman. So I think that's something that has really changed over the last 25 years. I don't think necessarily 25, 30 years ago, and maybe I'm wrong, that we have the the big difference that we have now. I mean, now, you know, if you look at the American Medical Writers Association Executive Council, I think there's maybe 3 or 4 men and what is it, 20 women or something. It's a big
Big
difference.
disparity.
And it's the same in the European Medical Writers Association. Big disparity between the women to men ratio, right? I don't think it was like that, not as large 25, 30 years ago.
My group was all women.
Was
The
it?
only man
Okay.
was the head of the group, and maybe that was unusual at the time. And maybe it just depends on the region you're in and the
Exactly. I
availability
don't
of
know.
it. There are so
Yeah.
many variables, it's really hard to, all we can speak to is whether we found a barrier, or we felt that our sex was even taken into consideration. I was asked, which I'm not sure you were allowed to then, and certainly you're certainly not allowed to ask now, whether I would be wanting to have children, because at that point that was a consideration for me. And I don't think that's, I don't know if it was legal then. You certainly wouldn't even ask that now. But I mean, I was honest and said, yeah, I would like another child, and I still got the job. So I can't say that was a barrier.
No, I can even take it a step further. At one point, I was applying for a position as a medical writer where I was, trying to progress my career. It was the next step up. It was going to be a management level. And during the interview process, I found out I was pregnant. I told them, and they called me back and they said, "We don't care. We want to hire you anyways."
That's very
So
progressive.
yeah. So for me, I definitely can say with certainty, being a woman in this role never presented as a barrier.
Mhm. I think that's very encouraging. I would just like to drill down a little bit into sort of, you mentioned, Julia, going back many years, yeah, and so we've got the benefit of a couple of decades having worked together, or actually more than 2 decades working together. And when you think about it, if you turn the clock back even further, I have the feeling women were disadvantaged in science in general. I'm thinking of one of the classics in the field of biology, the Watson-Crick Nobel Prize, and Rosalind Franklin, who did a lot of the work behind that and only got recognized after her unfortunate early death. And that was the end of the 50s. So if you turn the clock forward now, sort of more than 70 years now, or around 70 years, then have we seen any real change, let's say in the last 25 years, in professional attitudes towards women, not just in medical writing, but in leadership positions? I think both of you are in leadership positions, you've represented your company. And yeah, have you sensed any shift in change in attitude?
You know what? I think attitudes have definitely progressed and they've come on.
Absolutely.
What I think we ought to acknowledge is that both Julia and I are in leadership positions and came into leadership positions when we'd finished having our families. And I think it does need to be acknowledged that, because, I mean, women are the ones who actually give birth, they get pregnant, they need a lot of time off afterwards, often having had a child. That does impact your career. There is no way around it. It definitely does. You're having time out of the workplace.
Well, hang on, Lisa. I'm going to disagree with you because I raised my family through the entire time of developing and growing Trilogy.
But that was your company. That's different. You made the rules. Trilogy was your company. If you were in a leadership position in a pharmaceutical company or a company that wasn't yours, you would have had to abide by their rules and regulations.
It's still a management role, though. There's still a leadership role within the company.
Absolutely. But what I'm saying is, we came into our leadership roles, in your case, when you were already in your own company. In my case, after I had finished having my children. And I think it is different. I think there are still societal constraints that disadvantage women. I'm not saying it's specifically medical writing, but having to take time out to have a child does impact your career. There is no way around it. So I think that we could do more work on that side of things when women return to work and supporting them when they're out of the workplace.
Well, certainly at Trilogy, it doesn't disadvantage anyone. And we have several senior level managers who've had all of their children with us. They've taken the time off, they've come back, and it hasn't interfered
I totally
in
agree.
their progression.
And there's a reason why we've done that. And also, sorry, Douglas, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to pick up on that point from Julia, I think that really shows the fact that there can be the flexibility in our field of medical writing. Obviously, in Julia's situation, when we started Trilogy small and were growing the company, she had the flexibility to decide how that would work best for her. But I'm sure what you say, Lisa, is probably quite correct. In a big corporate structure, there are probably certainly other constraints on that. So I think that's very illustrative of how we can provide women with the flexibility they need when having a family. And I think that's certainly a very positive development. It probably goes hand in hand a little bit with the other flexibility we have, which is geographical flexibility, being able to work remotely. And so that expands the range of options another degree there. So I think that's very encouraging. And beyond that, I'd just like to spend a little time moving. We've established that medical writing has a predominance of women, which is a very good thing, and we've established that it has the flexibility. I think if we just move over a little bit to the role of women in clinical research in general. So we're very heavily involved in clinical research, and the one thing about women is that there are certain differences to men, obviously, yeah, and traditionally there's been this difference has been called like bikini medicine. They're the difference, but there is an increasing awareness of the fact that medicines may work differently in women to men, and this is something which has a lot of parallels to the interest which started maybe about 15 years ago in pediatric medicines, where there was this very strong initiative to investigate how medicines, which were previously never studied in children very much, could have different impacts. And so you're getting away from the classical white adult man as the focus of clinical research into distinct areas which may have different needs. And I was wondering if you could just provide some comment on your perception of that in the role of women in the world that we work in as medical writers.
No, absolutely, Douglas. I'm really pleased that you raised it. As you probably know, I wrote an article recently with Joe Paul about women's involvement in clinical development and the lack thereof. And a shout out to the Beyond Bikini Medicine movement at this point, because they've got some fantastic information freely available on the website that highlights this. But I was actually quite shocked. I'd always kind of assumed that because actually slightly over half of the population globally is female, that would be represented in clinical trials, but it's not the case. In 2019, for example, 16 of the 40 medicines registered by the FDA for conditions that affected both men and women had a female study population of less than 50%. And the problem with that is, much as it did with the pediatric regulation, it leads to gaps in prescribing medicine. In prescribing information, and even assumptions that are not true for women that only hold true for men. So I think morally and ethically, this is a problem, but beyond that, scientifically, it's a problem, and economically, it's a problem, which really surprised me. So I think between 1997 and 2000, 8 prescription drugs were retracted from the US market because there just hadn't been adequate clinical testing in women. They failed to identify that these drugs put women at greater risk of developing health problems compared with men. But that error alone cost pharmaceutical companies and taxpayers about $1.6 billion per drug. So there are loads of really, really good reasons why we need to have more women included throughout clinical development, not just post-clinical development.
Julia, did you want to chip in on that?
No, I mean, I know Lisa's done all the research on this, and her article covers it really well, the article she did with Joe. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's obvious that if you're going to develop a drug, you can't just make sure it's okay in one group of people.
Yeah.
You need to look, like you said, you need to look at women, you need to look at children, you need to look at the elderly, and all the various other subgroups that there are, right? So, yeah.
Which demonstrates the need to be all-inclusive, not only in who works in the industry we're working in, but actually the work we're doing as well. I mean, it touches on many different aspects there. So I think let's kind of try and wrap this up and ask, what message or advice would you have for girls wanting, or women wanting, to enter the field of science, and more specifically medical writing, maybe?
Well, I can speak to the medical writing for sure. I mean, I think what we talked about before is one of the big pluses. You can do medical writing from anywhere. And with the exception of when you have to have meetings with the team that you're working with, you can write at any time of day or night. So it's very well suited to bringing the flexibility that's needed to work your career around raising children. And obviously that is one of the primary things that tends to hinder women in their career progression, right? And so being a medical writer almost empowers us to not have to give anything up. You can do well at medical writing, you can do it around your children, and you can have your cake and eat it too.
I love that. Julia said it beautifully. Absolutely. I mean, Julia and I have both raised babies right the way up whilst working as medical writers, actively work as medical writers and progressing our careers. So it is absolutely possible. And beyond that, I think my advice would be to just find a company that does actively try to support women when in all aspects and all phases of their lives, and sees the value in them and helps them to move forwards. It's something that we feel very passionately about. And I'm including you in that, Douglas, because obviously this is your company too, and you've had a big say in what we do with all of this. Yeah, I feel very, very privileged to have been able to contribute to building a company that does support everybody. And we're talking about the paternity, kind of the paternity aspect as well as the maternity aspect. So we support everybody, but particularly I'm really proud that I've been able to kind of pay it forward and help the women coming up behind me as well.
I think that's a very important message. And if we just zoom out a little bit to finish up on, do either of you have ideas on what you see the role of women in science being in the next decade? How do you think we're going to progress from where we are now in general in women's participation as in science, maybe in medical writing, but more generally in science, I think?
Well, I mean, the good news is that there's already been quite a big shift in the proportion of women getting into science. I was looking at some data and recently, and I think it's 44%. This was sort of data from some STEM research in the UK. 44% of the women studying right now in physical sciences are women. And in Europe, I saw a number recently that was published in 2024, 42% of the women doing scientific research are women. So we're really approaching parity, right? 42%, 44%. We're not talking about just, a few. And it's really going in that direction. And I think what you spoke to, Douglas, before about the attitudes towards women largely in science have fallen away completely. I mean, when I see the women and the men of researchers, I haven't encountered, and I don't see it happening, for example, among our children, where the men have this idea that, well, women really shouldn't be doing science. They don't have the brain for it or whatever, those old-fashioned ideas. So I think everything is definitely going in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree with everything Julia has said. And both of us have daughters who have chosen to go into science. And certainly Tana's never said to me that she's encountered any kind of bias or barrier because of her sex. And I'm sure Lena has had similar experiences, Julia. So I think it is getting better. I would like to see more men in medical writing, by the way. That would be great. If we're talking about balance.
Well, that's
guys.
a topic for another podcast, I think. Yes,
Indeed.
the role of men in medical writing. Yeah, that would be
absolutely. We
great.
should do
but
that.
I think here, I think we've had a great discussion here on the role of women. I think what's very important as a sort of closing message is that the profession we work in is very suited to women. I wouldn't like to extrapolate that to all professions everywhere across the world, unfortunately.
Agreed.
But I think it shows we're a beacon of like the direction which things can move in a very positive way, and I think that's something which is a nice way to celebrate the day for girls and women in science. So I'd like to thank you both very much for your insights. It's been a pleasure as ever discussing these things, and we'll wait until the next podcast and maybe the role of men in science.
We're looking forward to that.
In science.
Definitely. Thanks.
Thank you,
Douglas.
Douglas.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to TriloTalk today. If you have feedback you'd like to share, Or if you have any ideas for future topics you'd like us to cover, particularly something you think the community should be talking about, we would love to hear it. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation with medical writers at large, and you can send us your comments on our Twitter feed or our LinkedIn page. Just a reminder, you can find all our episodes of TriloTalk podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, Spotify, and trilogywriting.com/TriloTalk. Have a great rest of your day.